Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for yet another session in this very exciting conference today about Iraq in a changing region. Is my microphone not on? Oh, okay. I think it just came on. Okay, I'm going to repeat that. Welcome, everyone, to another session in our Iraq Initiative annual conference. This session today is obviously a very timely one, Iraq in a changing region. I'm Lina Khatib, the director of the Middle East and North Africa program here at Chatham House, and I'm delighted to be joined by four eminent speakers on the panel. I'm going to introduce them shortly. First, just to say, this session, like the rest of the conference, is on the record. It's being live streamed, and there is also instant translation, simultaneous translation. For those in the room, hopefully you know what to do. It's just headphones. And for those joining us online, it's a headphone sign on the screen that you need to use. So I'll just say in Arabic for people joining online, في ترجمة فورية موجودة باللغتين العربي والإنجليزي. As you know, the session is about the other countries that surround Iraq and countries a bit further away that all have a stake in what is happening in Iraq today. And there have been a number of key changes that we could talk about today. Iraq is playing a more engaged role as a mediator, bringing different regional actors together to Baghdad. We've seen, of course, a new government in Iraq, and also changes in places like the United States with midterm elections. So the international and regional context is very much shifting and has a direct impact on the relationship between Iran and its neighbors and internationally. Our four speakers today, I'm just going to introduce them in the order in which I will invite them to speak. First, we have Hamid Reza Azizi, who is a Katz Fellow at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, SWP. Then we have Alistair Burt, who is Pro-Chancellor of Lancaster University, but is very well known to many of us as a former minister. He was minister for 11 years in the government of John Major and was minister for the Middle East and North Africa more than once. We also have Grigor Derakobian, who is a foreign policy advisor to the Iraqi Prime Minister al-Sudani. Previously, he was the Director General of Planning and International Relations Division at the Iraqi presidency. And last but not least, we have Jennifer Gavito, who's the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Iran, Iraq, and Public Diplomacy in the United States. Obviously, those joining us online, please send your questions whenever you want. I have a laptop in front of me that's going to display the questions through the chat options. And those in the room, if you want to ask a question later on, please remember to tell us your affiliation and name. So, without further ado, we're going to start with Iran, because this is always a hot question. So, let's start with the beginning. What are Iran's priorities in Iraq, and how will this engagement change, or will it change, now that there is a new government in place in Iraq?
First, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. So I want to go a little bit deeper and start with the perceptions of Iraq in Iran, because it's important to see what exactly we mean by Iraq when, we speak about that in Iran. So my argument is that there's at least 6 different perceptions of Iraq in Iran. And I would say there's even 6 different Iraqs, depending on who's your, interlocutor is. So one is obviously the geographical Iraq. Iraq is a neighboring country with which, having good economic and political relations is necessary. And there are people who've been advocating for that. For example, part of the kind of agenda of the former administration of President Rouhani was based on that. Especially since 2018, after the start of the maximum pressure, that kind of economic aspect started to be more important within the framework of Iran's regional policy in general, including in Iraq. So this is one aspect. The other aspect is what I would say the cultural Iraq. Iraq as a Shia majority country with cultural ties with Iran. So this has nothing to do with this or that faction. This has been in place since, even before the formation of modern states in both countries. And this has a kind of more social aspect. And this could be a basis for the development of a relationship between the two countries. Both in terms of this Shia religion between part of the Iraqi society and majority of the Iranians, and also when it comes to the Kurdish region of Iraq, that kind of sense of brotherhood or whatever we call it between the Kurdish people. But the thing is that this, and here I start talking about the changes, going into the third perception or the third Iraq. The third Iraq is an ideological Iraq, which we know quite well in terms of what the Iranian officials call the axis of resistance, their support for those Shia militias, etc., etc. So that started specifically speaking from 2003. After 2014, the rise of the ISIS and Iran's involvement in Iraq, it became more prominent. But the thing is that at the same time, since 2013, Iran started also to manipulate, the Islamic Republic started to manipulate also the cultural aspect, in the sense that we are seeing, for example, the Arba'in March, which in the sense that it happens today, is devised to be a replacement to Hajj, actually. Because that government, that the state emphasis on this Arba'in March started specifically since 2013, when relationship between Iran and Saudi Arabia started to get deteriorated. So the thing is that at least in the past 6-7 years, there has been a kind of government manipulation of the cultural Iraq and bringing it to the ideological Iraq, which has kind of, I would say, undermined the societal aspect of the relationship on the one hand, and on the other hand, it has damaged the Islamic Republic's own soft power in the country as well, because there has been a lot of backlash at the societal level. We all know in 2019, for example, the slogans were also directed towards the role of Iran. So that's ideological Iraq. Then we have geopolitical Iraq, obviously, in the sense that Iran sees or has been acting as if Iraq is a battlefield for, or a scene for its rivalries with Arab countries like Saudi Arabia, others more recently, as they claim, also Israel when it comes to the Iraqi Kurdistan region. So that's the geopolitical Iraq. Then Iraq itself, when it comes to geopolitics, there's a narrower aspect to that, which I would call the Arab Iraq. And that's what Iran has been afraid of in the sense of the rise of a nationalist Arab Iraq that would rise as a competitor, because there's been this historical sense of competition between the two sides, which also hugely intensified during the war, 8 years of war with the country. So that's one of the reasons that Iran is doing its best not to allow the formation of a nationalist, in the sense of Arab nationalist government in Iraq. And finally, the sixth aspect, which is the most recent one, or was the most recent one, is the diplomatic Iraq. What you just mentioned in terms of former Prime Minister Mustafa al-Kadhimi's efforts to turn Iraq into a venue for dialogue, actually, between Iran and Saudi Arabia. But then, my argument is that, to wrap it up and then allow for the discussion, my argument is that not since the formation or the announcement of the new government in Iraq, but actually since around 2020, actually, we've seen a trend, an emphasis or better to say a shift towards basically ideological, geopolitical, and Arab Iraq. These three perceptions have dominated basically Iran's approach toward Iraq, and these are the ones which are basically driving Iran's policy toward Iraq. So it's been more securitized, it's been more of a geopolitical nature right now, and interestingly, this is in line with the trend that we've seen inside the country. So I would say Iran's foreign policy, especially regional policy, has always been a reflection of its, I mean, like many other countries, of course, but in the specific case of Iran and speaking of its role in Iraq, there has been, inside the country, there has been a tendency towards more kind of military role in the sense of IRGC getting more power, Iron Fist, etc. And the same has happened in terms of securitization of Iran's regional policy. So that has made Iran's kind of influence in Iraq more of a hard nature, but being hard means that it's less flexible and more fragile. So my argument is that the level of Iran's influence in Iraq is still high. We shouldn't be in any illusion of that. It is high, but the depth is rather low because of the reasons I mentioned, that cultural, ideological, societal aspect on both sides, because, we've seen also a backlash on the Iranian society towards the role of Hashd al-Sha'bi, etc. So this is my main argument. I stop here, and then if there's questions, we can.
Yeah, thank you so much. I bet there are many questions in many people's minds regarding, especially what you said at the end. So I want to actually jump to Alistair. I'm going to alternate kind of the regional and the international. So in light of what we heard, but also more broadly, what should international policymakers who are seeking to support Iraq state building engage with the new government? And what you just heard about Iran is something that, in my view, the international community perhaps has been approaching from a rather narrow lens. I don't know if you agree or disagree on that, but how should the policymakers in the West address the issue of Iran in Iraq, and also how will this influence the way they engage with the new government?
Okay, well, like others, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here and the excellent panel and what we've heard this morning. Thank you so much for the chance. It's great to see so many people engaged. I'd like to answer both bilaterally and in relation to sort of the international community more generally. I think the first thing I would say is that the states that have been engaged with Iraq in the past, stay engaged. Stay engaged. There's all sorts of things that might make you feel, why are we doing this? And my first plea to colleagues would be, put that out of your system. It's really important. Iraq continues to face a significant number of challenges in which the international community has played its part. So stay engaged would be the first thing. Stay engaged through the work being done, humanitarian and reconstruction. My notes told me that the last time I was in Iraq as minister was 2019. I went up to Mosul, saw some of the work being done there, being able to bring people back to where they had been moved from. Those threats are all there. That work still needs to be done. And so I'd make a plea to continue that work. The UK has spent several hundred millions of pounds on humanitarian stabilisation work. That should absolutely continue. We need to support those who in Iraq are attempting to overcome the challenges we heard about this morning. We should encourage private sector involvement and development because it's one of the potential antidotes to corruption. Nothing there is easy. I thought Michael Mason's description of some of the problems in Basra with water struck a chord. Those people in the FCO and the Department of International Trade and other colleagues who've been involved with Bywater over the years, who had some answers to the water problems in Basra, well, that gets nowhere because of exactly the problems that Michael was talking about. There's always someone who wants to take a cut somewhere, and sooner or later, companies who could deliver are just going to walk away with all the efforts that we're trying to make. So, but we've got to encourage that as much as possible. Fourthly, stay involved with the building of democracy. because those projects really matter. I was last in Baghdad about a month ago. I was there with a project sponsored by the UK government on democracy building, run through an NGO called Global Partners Governance, and we work with Parliament and have been for a number of years. We work with parliamentary staff, with members of Parliament, and we work on the sort of work which they believe they need to do in order to deliver better for the constituents that really matter to some of them. We know about the problems of parliamentary democracy and the pressures of the blocs and others, but there are MPs who want to do things differently. They want their committees to have real oversight. They want accountability through parliamentary committees of those who are running the ministries. And they get help and assistance from those who have worked as professionals in Parliament, the committee clerks and others who go over, transfer their skills as well as members of Parliament. It works and it matters, and so long as there's somebody wanting to wave a flag for democracy, keep it going. So those are the bilateral issues, stay engaged. As far as the international issues are concerned, I think it's a fruitless task to analyse each Iraqi government as it comes in terms of where it may be in relation to Iran and whether you should make a judgment as whether you deal with it on that basis or not. Forget it. Iran is going to continue to be a factor in Iraqi politics for as long as the two countries remain geographically close together, which I suspect is quite a long time. And you know, geography matters, as you occasionally have to explain to all sorts of people. Therefore, I don't think there's a point in trying to analyse each government to the nth degree in terms of relationships. Those will come out over time. And always there's a speculation about who's been close to who, why, etc. I think the UK government, if it's still in the same place as it was when I was there, you take governments broadly as you find them. It's the process in somebody else's country. They produce a government, and then you work out how to deal with it. But for the most part, you accept what people have delivered, and then you work. And in Iraq, in all fairness, it doesn't change all that much. You can juggle the chairs about a bit, but essentially the sort of issues we were talking about this morning, we were talking about when I was First Minister in 2010, and I suspect we'll be talking about it in 10 years. How do you divide up the ministries? If you're going to do it that way, who gets what ministries? Why are they doing that? Because that's the way the money flows through the patronage and everything else. Is that going to change overnight? No, it's not. So what is the practical effect? I seem to remember a cry, we want a homeland. And I seem to remember people responding to that cry. Well, unless that's really being listened to, and unless what people were asking for is responded to, some of the issues that we're talking about today will simply get bigger and get worse, and they will erupt in more tragic demonstrations as the public demand what they're entitled to. Bad governance litters the region. There's no point in picking out Iraq. Bad governance litters the region and ensures that people do not have the lives they're entitled to. And I think it's incumbent upon all who are involved in public administration to do their best to change that, because that's the pathway to stability, prosperity, and everything else. So with that, I think we'll make judgments on the efforts that the new Prime Minister is making. He has a credible track record from governance at various levels through the years, a good recognition factor from many of the states that will be involved with Iraq. And as always, you judge on results and everything else. But unless the anti-corruption rhetoric, the determination to deliver better through the governance, through the committees of representatives, through local devolution, unless that actually delivers to people, then we'll be back with a crisis before too long. So that's the sense where the government needs to be. But if they want to tackle those things, then I would hope that all governments that have been involved in the past will be helping and encouraging that process to succeed.
Thank you so much. And thank you also for the refreshing reminder that engagement with a particular government is not to be confused with engagement with the country, because very often people get too perhaps sucked into the kind of small details that, and you're reminding us that there are bigger details that seem to be quite enduring, regardless of who is prime minister or the government in charge. And with that, I want to move to Grigor. You're right there with the new government and the prime minister's office, and you've just heard two perspectives on Iran and also on the international community. So what challenges and opportunities do these things bring you in your new role with the prime minister's office?
In terms of foreign relations or in general?
You can choose to address it however you
Since
like.
my portfolio focuses on foreign relations,
Yes.
I'm going to start with that, and
Yes.
if there are any questions, I'd be willing to take them. The Prime Minister has assumed responsibility in a region that is very important but very volatile, that is heavily divided. Tensions in the region escalate, and Iraq is in a position, is in the middle of this region because of its identity, because of its diversity. It's linked to countries, to many countries in the region. And whatever happens impacts developments inside the country. The new Prime Minister understands Iraq's history, appreciates Iraq's geographic location and what Iraq symbolizes, and wants to open up to the region and constructively engage and actively engage countries in the region. This also stems from his understanding of his own identity. We have to understand who Mohammad Shia al-Sudani is to appreciate where he's coming from and where he's heading. Mohammad Shia al-Sudani is a relatively young prime minister, the first non-exiled Iraqi to have assumed this post in post-2003 Iraq. He has risen through the ranks of the Iraqi bureaucracy since 1997, so we can clearly see a continuity there. From the mayor of a small and remote town, to a member of a provincial council, to a governor, to an elected member of parliament, minister of several ministries, then chief executive and commander-in-chief. His family are the proud sheikhs of a very prominent Arab tribe in Iraq. He is also a conservative. So his identity is bound to have a profound impact on his policies in general, foreign policy in particular, with special emphasis on regional relations. The principal guidelines of his foreign policy are multi-vector foreign policy, positive neutrality. These two means that not taking sides, but constructively engaging actors within the region, non-interference in the domestic affairs of other states, and very importantly, not permitting state or non-state actors from using Iraqi airspace, Iraqi territory, and Iraqi territorial waters to launch an attack against any regional country. This is very important to understand where will Mohammad Shia be heading. But he also understands the challenges that he is going to face. Some of these challenges plague the legacy of his predecessor. He understands that any ambitious chief executive who wants to embark on such a regional opening, he will always have a soft belly of an internally divided and weak Iraq. He understands the importance of a social contract in a democratic country. Therefore, he's trying to engage his compatriots, trying to take into consideration their grievances and their demands in order to enlist their support for his initiatives. His government program includes some of the grievances of these communities, and he has already started to act on them. He also understands when it comes to internal politics that a significant socio-political group of his co-religionists have been outside of government. Even though by their own choice, but it's very significant and important that this group feels reassured and safe. And he has taken the initiative to signal this, even though they have chosen to stay out of the government. It's important for them to feel that Iraq as a country belongs to every Iraqi, and the government intends to demonstrate that. He has gone to reverse many of the steps that were undertaken by his predecessor because the judiciary found them to be illegal. But he has reassigned some of the figures to the positions they had been assigned to, just to signal this. The only exception would be if anyone is plagued with allegations of corruption. Then that he would not compromise on this issue, regardless of the person's political background, political affiliation, or ethnic and sectarian background. One of the key things that the Prime Minister wants to achieve is monopoly over the means of violence. Iraq cannot engage in any constructive way in the region without attaining this essential element of statehood. To his credit, he has started this way before he became a candidate. During the negotiations phase with the political parties that coalesced together to form the largest bloc. And there are good reasons to believe that we will see a noticeable difference when it comes to this. Finally, I might have taken longer than I should have. I want to point one issue. And when it comes to regional relations, it's a two-way street. Iraq intends to extend its hand to countries in the region. It takes two to tango. It takes many to Debka, or as we say in Iraq, Chobi. So Iraq is extending its hand and hopes that our brotherly countries would reciprocate. It is unfair to judge Iraq in the light and in the policies and tendencies of former chief executives and former governments. It is only fair to judge the new prime minister and the new government based on its own merits and its own policies and its own performance. It is counterproductive if we don't learn from our past mistakes and from our history. And we owe it to ourselves, to our countries, and to our peoples to open up. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And again, many questions in our heads, but last and not least, we're going to hear from Jennifer. So obviously, there's a new government. We're having different perspectives now presented, both and both are valid in terms of there's bigger enduring issues, but then there's specificities regarding who the new prime minister is and what the new government is like. So how will the US navigate this in Iraq?
Sure. Thanks. So I actually think Alistair said it beautifully. There is great continuity in our foreign relations, whether it's related to Iraq or the broader region. And so for us, and as Krikor notes, we work with a government that has been democratically selected by the Iraqi people. We've been clear since the October 10th, 2021 election that we were prepared to work with any government that put the needs of the Iraqi people at the forefront of its agenda and that supported Iraqi sovereignty. And that's exactly what we're doing. We welcome the formation of the new government. We, I think as people in this room know, ended combat operations in Iraq in December of last year. And since that time, my colleagues throughout the US government and I have been working hard on what we call an affirmative agenda for our partnership with Iraq. Taking a step back, before I get into that affirmative agenda, I think most people in this room have probably heard the president talk about Iraq, but it bears repeating that for him, Iraq is a strategic long-term partner and one that is absolutely central to the stability of the broader Middle East. And he feels that very personally. And so that is what has driven our formation of a policy over these last months. And so with now a government on the other side, we can really start to operationalize what that affirmative agenda looks like. And it looks like it does with any number of other bilateral partners that we have throughout the region and around the world. It's conversations about energy modernization, clean energy, climate change, addressing the very difficult water management and energy issues in Iraq. It's tough conversations about things like corruption and human rights that we talk to all of our partners about. It's, as Alistair notes, the private sector is absolutely fundamental to long-term economic prosperity. And so we are looking at ways that we can support entrepreneurship and the private sector writ large within Iraq. healthcare, education, all things that the United States government brings resources to bear on, and where we can partner with our colleagues in the new Iraqi government to, as we said, put the needs of the Iraqi people at the forefront of our common agenda. Our relationship with Iraq continues to be guided by the Strategic Framework Agreement that was reaffirmed in, I guess, the summer of 2021, that touches on all of these things as critical to how we move forward. I think there will be an opportunity for follow-up, and happy to delve into any of it, but I do want to acknowledge the role that the regional partners play in the region. And it's absolutely correct that Iraq shares a long border with Iran. That is, in fact, a geographical fact that's unlikely to change anytime soon. And so we understand the need for Iraq and Iran to have a positive relationship. That is very much part of our policy, as is strengthened relationships with countries around the rest of the region as well. We all have an interest in making sure that this new government is successful and can deliver on all of those things that Krikor laid out. And the United States stands ready to do its part, to be a partner, to be a friend, and to move forward on this affirmative agenda.
Okay, thank you so much. I actually, if you will allow me, have follow-up questions to all of you. I encourage people online to send their questions through the chat, and we'll very soon also open up, not yet, one very keen person, but we will soon open up space for questions from the audience. But if you'll allow me just to kind of, I don't want to use the word provoke, but get a hint. Jennifer, what you're saying sounds very encouraging. However, some people say that the US has generally disengaged from the Middle East, with Iraq being part of this. I'm not saying that, you know, of course the US has ignored Iraq in any way. Of course not, and here you are. However, some say that perhaps the rolling back of a degree of engagement by the United States in places like Iraq and the region at large is what spurred regional actors to kind of come together and try to figure out ways of dealing with one another, especially when it comes to the issue of Iran. So what do you say to people who kind of present that perspective on general US disengagement?
Sure. You know, I'm familiar with that narrative, and I think, you know, we would strongly reject it. I think what people see are, you know, the challenges that we collectively are looking at around the world, whether it's the war in Ukraine, whether it is the rising influence of China and the implications for all of us in that. You know, it is a complicated moment for the world. And so it is absolutely correct that the United States, the UK, others take a look strategically at the landscape and deploy resources accordingly. But that doesn't mean pulling back. And I don't think we've done that. We saw President Biden in the region just a couple of months ago in Jeddah. We continue to have robust engagement on with regional partners on the full range of issues, to include Iraq, where we are deeply invested in that country's future success. So I understand, particularly if we're candid, in the wake of Afghanistan, why people take that view or worry that maybe Iraq could be next, which is why I welcome any opportunity to say very clearly that Iraq is not Afghanistan. Iraq for us is a long-term strategic partner, and our commitment to it will not and does not change. At the same time, though, I do think that it's right that the region takes some responsibility for regional dynamics. Ultimately, it isn't up to the United States to determine what the relationship between Iraq and Iran is. That is something for Iraq and its government to guide, in coordination, of course, with the Iranians. It's the same throughout the rest of the region. There has to be shared responsibility for I guess, determining what values, what rules of the road, what investment looks like. This is not a U.S. responsibility. It is a collective and especially regional responsibility. So we're still there as a partner in helping to shape that. Certainly we do so in light of our own interests, as every country does. But also, there is an important role for each of these countries to play themselves in determining what sort of relationship they want with Iran specifically moving forward.
Okay, thank you. Grigor, I want to move to you next, in a way building on this conversation. You mentioned a number of things about the importance of positive neutrality, engaging with regional actors. There's kind of two sides to the question. One is, does this mean that the new government in Iraq is going to support Arab initiatives like the tripartite alliance between Egypt, Iraq, and Jordan? That's one side of it, kind of on a diplomatic level. On a kind of more operational security kind of leaning level, what will the new government do concretely about non-state armed actors that are threatening Gulf states? Because if you're going to have good relations and support a tripartite alliance, then that kind of other dynamic might undermine it.
It does. Was your first question, is Iraq going to support the Arab League's efforts in the trilateral?
The trilateral alliance between
So basically
Egypt,
the question,
Iraq,
will
and
Iraq
Jordan
continue on the former policy of the two predecessors, Adel Abdel Mahdi and Mustafa al-Kadhimi, in engaging with Egypt and Jordan? Yes, very constructively.
Okay, great. Will the other one undermine the efforts like that?
The non-state actors launching attacks? As I said, the Prime Minister foresaw this issue. He is very determined to succeed, and he has started to lay the ground for this since before he was a nominee. He has spoken to the political factions and forces in the coalition about the need to maintain monopoly over the use of violence, and that he, as a Prime Minister and Chief Executive and Commander-in-Chief, is the sole responsible for any violent actions taken by the state. He has received assurances and promises. In exchange, he has demonstrated that he is willing to take action, and he will take action if any party does not abide by this agreement. Iraq, as I said, is a pluralistic country. For better or for worse, there are good things about this and there are bad things about this. The process of formulating policies, reaching decisions is long and arduous. There is no just one chief executive who decides and it happens. He's doing what he needs to do, and he is determined to enforce it.
Okay, it'll be very, very interesting to see how he actually implements this.
Of course, he will always try to preempt it, because it's going to get very ugly if he tries to enforce it, to be very blunt. But he will do what it takes.
Thank you. Hamid, over to you now. I want to pick up on something you said at the end of your comments, which is, if I understood it correctly, that you think that in light of the hard line that Iran has come to take in recent years regarding Iran, that its influence is less flexible but also more fragile. And I just wanted you to elaborate a bit on what you mean.
Yeah, sure. Look, I mean, there's also perceptions of Iran, right? When we speak about Iran, as was mentioned, Iran is a neighboring country to Iraq. So regardless of whatever happens in Iran as well, they are going to remain neighbors, and then Iran will maintain a certain degree of influence. So that's a different matter. So what I'm talking about in terms of the fragility of this influence has been sort of the process that has been going on, devised by mostly by the IRGC, but broadly speaking, it's been the Islamic Republic's Iraq policy over the past decades. Of course, we look at the developments, we can see how Iran-backed groups or pro-Iran groups, whatever we call them, within the coordination framework could reverse the kind of outcome of the election. And then now we have a prime minister toward whom Iran has a more favorable view. And looking at the narrative inside Iran, there's this argument that the current administration, the current Iraqi government, is more pro-resistance, as they call it. But then they also talk about, speaking about the narrative right now in Iran, there's at least 3 challenges that they mention specifically regarding the current situation. One is the unpredictability of the other actors, especially Muqtada al-Sadr. So I've seen this quite frequently, in the arguments that, of course, Sadr has announced his withdrawal, but it doesn't mean that he's not going to come in once again, and especially given the mobilization capacity that he has. This is one of the sources of concern for Iran. The second one is, which is, I would say, more important, this public dissatisfaction, widespread public dissatisfaction, not toward this or that government, but toward the way the governance has been in Iraq in general. So I've seen even mentions to the fate of the government of Adel Abdul Mahdi, which didn't last long, and there are some analogies, and there are these concerns that the same might happen to the new government. And finally, there's kind of comparative influence that Iran has compared to its rivals, like Saudi Arabia, like Turkey, like others. Speaking of economic relationship, for example. So why I'm saying this is fragile, because economy, soft power, these are the foundations of any kind of sustainable relationship, and these have been sort of eroded over time. There might be a process, a fundamental change in Iran, in Iraq, that might, mean a kind of total redefinition of Iran's policy towards Iraq. But the way that it is right now, I think it is it doesn't have that societal, cultural, and economic base, and for that reason it is fragile, especially in a comparative perspective with other regional powers, basically.
Thank you. Alistair, over to you before I open up the floor to questions. Surely, when you say the international community should let the Iraqis kind of lead and then engage accordingly, but the international community is also not neutral. And so we also, as an international community, bear a responsibility for how we have been engaging with Iraq over the years. One of the key issues, of course, in Iraq right now is that of reform and accountability, and you alluded to that. Some of us analysts sitting outside, sometimes feel that perhaps some of the international engagement, in a way, I don't want to say enabled, but perhaps did not address this issue in perhaps the best way possible, in the way we've been approaching the region as a whole. I mean, I personally have written not on Iraq, but generally speaking about a context like Lebanon, where I feel that sometimes the international community prefers to engage with the devil we know rather than engage with potential new voices that we don't know. And therefore, this in a way contributes to keeping the corrupt political system in place. So that's in the case of Lebanon. In the case of Iraq, how can the international community pursue more sustainable strategies for accountability and reform in Iraq?
Okay. Clearly, you're absolutely right that the international community in its various guises, of course, has a recent history in Iraq as well as a longer history. And I don't think any serious state would avoid that. And I think that's why I said right at the beginning, remaining engaged is really important. Dealing with the devil, well, you're dealing with those you've got. And it's not a question of choice. If governments emerge, there's a relationship with them. But I would be extremely surprised if there was any government who did not make sure that they spoke to those who were both in office and those who might be in office. Governments don't just speak to those in power. Governments go beyond that in order, to talk to those who might go into power, those who lead civic society movements, those who are involved in all sorts of representations of society that you would expect to happen. I know the British government did, and I'm absolutely certain others do as well. So you are talking to people who will want to play their part in a parliamentary system by being prepared to challenge the status quo and use for instance, to use parliamentary structures to hold ministers to account, to ensure that the Prime Minister's determination and policies to reform, whether it's in the energy sector, the power sector, whether it's in the delivery of services, is called into account and challenged by people who sit on committees and are able to pass legislation to encourage and support what they're doing. And they will be supporters of the bloc in charge as well as those who are not. So I think in that way, other governments play a part in supporting the process, not opposing a sitting government, but encouraging the processes and recognising that in a system where there is challenge, where there is national challenge, not external challenge, they're working through that. And I think also, lastly, in terms of the importance of assertiveness in the region now, because I entirely concur with Jen's analysis. The region is more assertive than it was. You can't erase the history of the last 20 years and the things that have been difficult. States have looked at those from outside, as we have looked at our own interventions and thought, maybe there is a better way to handle this. And certainly the diplomacy that we saw from Baghdad in working with Saudi Arabia and Iran to try and find relationships there, that's very good news. We would all want to see that encouraged. Using the threat of climate change to find ways in which people can work together, as we discussed this morning, that diplomatic initiative will be supported by those outside. I think that's the process. I think that's the way forward. So states that want to see Iraq succeed, because a successful Iraq in the region will add to the other stability in the region. Their nearest neighbour, well, I think being honest, what you would fear is that the way in which Iraq might want to see Iran may not be wholly reciprocated by all those in Iran, who may always want to see something slightly different in terms of their own control. But no one will know that better than the Prime Minister and the existing government, who will know what the circumstances are and know what they need to do in order to counter that. And Iran has its own challenges at the moment, but and there are all sorts of other things going on. But a more stable region, I think Iraq has got a huge part to play in that, already demonstrated that, and from what we've heard, clearly seems determined to pursue that.
Thank you. Okay, patient people in the audience who want to ask questions. I have so many hands. I'm going to take 3 at a time. Whoa, we have 20 minutes. Let's try to do this as quickly as possible. Please say your name and your affiliation, starting with you, sir, and then yourself, and then I'll take a question from there. So let's start.
Hi, yes, my name is Adai. I'm just independent. My question to Alistair. You mentioned that since 2010, on your watch, you see the governments formed in terms of ministers meeting, or they just distribute the budget or the departments between themselves, and it's the same faces. I just want to tell you that this system is since 2005, since its formation, has been more than 17 years. It's the same faces or the same players, nothing changed, and it's full with corruption as well. Many Iraqis, they see. Sorry, no, this is very important.
Because we only have 20 minutes, yes. And I have a sea
1 minute. Many Iraqis, they see that this system created by the West, and you force these people on us. These people, they are with the guns. There's no democratic way to get rid of them. So what's the responsibility of the West to change or fix the mess that they created? And this question as well to Jennifer.
Thank you. We move to, yes, yourself. You're next. If we could just have a microphone. Please introduce yourself.
Yes, hi. My name is Nicole Pichet. I represent the All-Party Parliamentary Human Rights Group. A couple of questions. First, Turkey. There's been one brief mention of Turkey, and I'd like to know what the panel thinks about Turkey's role within the region, and particularly in Iraq. And then I'd like to know about Iraq's positioning in terms of the wider world. We've talked about the region, we've talked about the US and the UK, but what about the other major players in the world? China, Russia, at the UN? How does Iraq see itself on the wider world stage, and what are its ambitions in that regard?
Thank you so much. We're going to move to you, sir. Yes.
Hi, hello. Yassam Maliki from MEES, Gulf Analyst. The question is about Saudi Arabia, the big elephant in the room maybe. The relations, the rapprochement went through two pivotal years, 2014, when the Saudis were instrumental in putting a coalition against ISIS, 2016, when they needed Iraq to be part of the OPEC cut. In the last 2 weeks, we have heard mixed messaging from Mr. Sudani and also the region, so he wants to renegotiate the benchmark production quota for Iraq. At the same time, Saudi infrastructure has been threatened, and the Saudis want to cease talks in Baghdad. They don't want to continue that. That's what we heard. The question here is, what's the outlook for the Iraq-Saudi relations? Because it's very important for the region. This is one. And also, when it comes to the Iraq-Saudi relationship, it is impacted by the fact that Mr. Sudani was close to Mr. Maliki. That is also another factor that you may have, Mr. Grigor, you may have alluded to when you said, well, we shouldn't be judging Mr. Sudani based on his past and so on. So just what's the outlook, really?
Okay, thank you. I'm going to take one more question. At the front. I don't know whose hand was first between the three of you. Okay. All right, great. I like this democracy, yes.
شكرا جزيلا. أنا آلا طلباني عضو مجلس نواب سابق. سؤالي تحديدا الصديق غريغور. جنابك تحدثت عن برنامج رئيس الوزراء في موضوع العلاقات الخارجية. أنا عندي سؤال. أنا 16 سنة كنت عضو مجلس نواب عراقي و8 سنوات كنت في لجنة العلاقات الخارجية. لحد الآن ما عرفت منو يرسم سياسة العراق الخارجية.
That's a great question.
شخص رئيس الوزراء ما يقدر يرسم سياسة العراق الخارجية. احنا نحتاج مؤسسة بوزير دفاع يعني جهاز بالأمن الوطني بإقليم كردستان. اليوم إيران قصفت كويسنجق ب4 صواريخ. لحد الآن احنا ننتظر موقف من الحكومة. السيد أحمد الصحاف طلع الخارجية تدين ويستدعى السفير، وهكذا بالنسبة في مجلس النواب احنا أحزاب يعني مو متحالفة من أجل مناصب. أنا أقولها بصراحة وأنا حزبية. دائما في لجنة العلاقات كان عندنا مشكلة من يصير قصف أو تجاوز نطلع بيان مشترك، ما متفقين. كلكم تعرفون في قرار إخراج القوات الأمريكية والأجنبية الكرد والسنة قاطعوا الاجتماع ولم يصوتوا. أنا كنت نائبة ورئيسة كتلة سياسية، أنا وكتلتي ما شاركنا في تصويت لإخراج القوات. فإذا المشكلة أريد أفهم بعد 16 سنة عضو في البرلمان من يرسم سياسة العراق الخارجية، كم نذهب مع هذه الدولة، كم نتراجع، ما هي الملفات اللي يخلينا نحدد. شكرا جزيلا.
شكرا. Okay, so we have 4 questions. 3 of them are directed at yourself, Grigor. Yeah, of course. I mean, they're all interlinked. For the sake of my colleagues who may not speak Arabic, the last question can be summarized as, who actually sets Iraq's foreign policy? She's talking about divisions in parliament, but who ultimately makes the decision about let's engage with this country and not that country? Who sets the foreign policy? So, Grigor, the questions revolve around Turkey's role, Russia, China, the outlook for Saudi, Iraqi relations, and of course the golden question.
Yes. Shall I start with Turkey?
Whatever you would like.
That was the first question, if I'm not mistaken. Turkey is a very important regional actor. is a neighbor, is a source of our water resources. I think is one of the largest, if not the largest, economic partner to Iraq. Turkey maintains 4 permanent bases today in Iraq, military bases, and more than 100 outposts. So it's a very complicated relationship. The issue of Iran today bombarding Iraq was mentioned, but the issue of the constant bombardment of Turkey to Iraq never gets mentioned. So how are we going to deal with Turkey? As I said, the same answer will apply to several of the questions that have come up. Iraq lacks a social contract. Internally, it needs to be unified before we can project a coherent foreign policy. It's impossible under the current system with weak institutions to formulate a coherent and sound foreign policy. This is why it will always be upon the incumbent, upon the chief executive, to react to the developments that are going on. Under the new government, there is a determination to build up the institutions, to formulate a coherent foreign policy, and to get the buy-in of the respective internal actors to come to understand on the basics of this foreign policy in order to be able to project influence in the region. I think this kind of simultaneously answers the different questions that I have received, and especially the question of Allah Khan. As for the KSA, if you can remind me of your question.
The outlook for Iraqi-Saudi relations.
Saudi is one of the most important countries when it comes to our foreign policy and our foreign relations. When I mentioned that Iraq will be extending its arm and hopes that the others would reciprocate, I was mainly talking about the KSA. We look forward to the best possible relations, and we hope that we will have a partner in Riyadh who looks forward to such a partnership and relationship. This serves the best interests and the common national security of both countries.
Okay, anything on China and Russia?
As I said, Iraq employs the principle of multi-vector foreign policy. Prime Minister Mohammad Shia al-Sudani is not looking for any enemies. He wants to enlist and enchant as many friends as he can. We value our partnership with the United States of America, and we see the importance. It's one of the most important countries when it comes to relations with the world. But there's no way that our relation with Russia and China will be at this expense or vice versa.
Yeah, that's very clear. Thank you. I'm going to take another round because there are so many hands.
I have a very brief question.
Okay, please do.
A brief answer on the basis that another variation on the theme, it's all our fault, which is frequent. But just to answer you seriously, there are plenty who will say that the issues of governance in Iraq go long beyond 2003. But I accept the premise of the question. But if that's correct, then the last people you would want to come up with a solution to the problem since 2003-05 is us. So we're not. I think it's perfectly clear now that the issue of the determination of the future of governance in Iraq will be quite properly in the hands of the Iraqi people and those who are elected and guiding them. It won't be in the hands of anyone from outside. But that those demands are very clear and may be different to how elites may think from what we saw from Tishreen and what we saw in 2019. As I made the point earlier, unless those voices are listened to, then the direction of governance will not be where Iraq needs to be and not be where Iraq will be secure. And that's the voices that need to be heard by government, and that's what we're hearing.
If I can just very briefly add on specifically to the question of the armed actors, we've invested heavily in providing the Iraqi security forces with the training needed in order to take on the mantle of security for its own country. Political will is something, though, that, as Alistair notes, we can't provide. And so it is a complicated question what role these organizations play. But the answer lies with the Iraqis, not with an imposed solution.
And as Krikos said, if institutions are weak, it's institutions that need to be built up.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to take 3 questions, very brief, if you can. Yes, and I'll decide later, who's going to be the third person. But yes, because we only have like 8 minutes.
Thank you very much for the panelists. I'm Dia Al-Asadi, a politician and academic. My question is to Mr. Krikor. We have all agreed in our discussions, previous discussions and elsewhere, that corruption, lack of good governance, and lack of accountability are among the most serious problems any government has so far faced. You are telling us now that Prime Minister Mohammad Shia al-Sudani has reached out to everybody, seeking their complacency and trying to appease everybody. So who the corrupt people are, and who is going to hold them accountable? If everybody is included, is it, I mean, it is not a new arc. This is a government that needs to be divided between the opposition and the acting people. Does he have any program to fight corruption? And as I said, he should have diagnosed and he should have identified the corrupted people being part of the government for several years. My question is, if this is the approach of complacency government, how corruption can be fought? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Thank you. My name is Mustafa. I'm from Barzani Charity Foundation and then also independent researcher. My question is really for Mr. Croker. Sorry for mispronunciation. One of the questions is regarding reaching out to other country, example Saudi Arabia, right? It's obviously one of their conditions, I guess, is they want to have a secure Iraq, stable Iraq, a security not just for Iraqi but for the neighboring country as well. My question is this: some of the militia group, although they've been legitimatized by or been legally abided by through the Iraqi government, but also they are pro one country to another, and then they are more loyal to one faction than the actual governmental institution. So what is your expectation how the country like Jordan, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, how far they want to reach out to you while your country maybe is a strategic threat to their future stable security and their governance system? Is it clear?
Yeah. Thank you. Let's take one final question. Salman, let's go with you. Sorry, we only have 5 minutes, so let's keep the answers short and the questions short.
Good afternoon. I'm Salman Sheikh. I'm the founder of the Sheikh Group. A very simple question, but maybe a more complicated answer. The Baghdad Conference initiative, which Prime Minister Kadhimi and President Barham Saleh were behind, what is the status of that under the new Prime Minister? And I wonder what the attitude is of other international guests on the panel to that.
All right, thank you so much. So 3 questions. If everyone will be engaged, how can you actually fight corruption? And the question following that is really about how can regional actors trust Iraq under the current kind of power dynamics? And the final one is what's happening with the Baghdad conference. So a lot of attention to yourself.
I thank Mr. Dia Al-Asadi for his question. If that is what I had said, then I have misspoken. One of the top priorities of the current Prime Minister is to fight against corruption. Iraq has adopted the principle of informal consociationalism, specifically, and I keep bringing this up because of the lack of a social contract. So it's very difficult to have groups outside of government and groups inside of government. Every group wants to become part of the government. The only exception has been the step that Sayyid Muqtada Sadr has taken so far. Other than that, no one has taken such a step. But as I said, even though the actors are inside the government, the Prime Minister will have zero tolerance towards corruption. I think we can all agree that he has an impeccable record when it comes to clean-handedness. So something that he hasn't accepted for himself, he will not accept for anyone else. He will pursue this all the way to the end. Of course, in Iraq, he's not the absolute power. He needs to share power. There is the Integrity Commission, there is the judiciary. He can point out the corrupt, send them to the process, and a due process will have to be undertaken. Punishment is not up to him. The judiciary needs to take that part. So the other question is?
How can regional actors trust Iraq in
How
light
can
of...
they not? Can we afford not to trust each other? The least we can do is to give it a chance. As I said, we owe it to ourselves, we owe it to our peoples. Try to reach out and judge based on the performance of the chief executive. Not to engage with Iraq. The consequences of not engaging Iraq are far worse than at least trying, giving it a shot, then deciding.
Okay, and the
Very
future
simply.
of the Baghdad conference?
You will very soon hear very good news. At the third end of December, I think the second round will take place.
Okay, if I may go to you, Hamid, very quickly on the Baghdad conference. What does Iran think of this?
I think it was quite clear in the level of Iran's participation also with regard to Turkey, because they didn't send, the president didn't come, it was the foreign minister. So they do appreciate, I think, the role of Iraq, or they did at least, the role of Iraq as a mediator in regional conflicts. But Iran's main problem, specifically speaking about this Baghdad conference, was the active engagement of France. Because for Iran, it's a non-starter. I mean, the involvement of other countries, especially Western countries, in those formats. I don't see the Baghdad conference to have the potential for any substantial, changes, for example, in the relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia, etc. If something is going to be successful, it's those same bilateral tracks between Iran and Saudi Arabia, Iran and Jordan, etc. So this is my understanding.
Okay, Jennifer, if I may close with you, a pressing question. Midterm elections in the US, does this have any bearing on engagement with Iraq?
No, I don't think it does, for all the right reasons. Support for Iraq, commitment to Iraq's stability, continuing to partner with Iraq, that has bipartisan support. Throughout the last 20 years. And you can certainly have a conversation about the ways that has unfolded, but it's been bipartisan in nature. It continues to be bipartisan in nature. And so the United States is going nowhere. We look forward to a productive relationship with the new government and are happy the midterms are behind us.
Thank you. And final word from you, Alistair.
I just wanted to say that as far as trusting government is concerned, I think the United Kingdom has changed its government slightly more frequently than anyone else in the region. And we're still very hopeful that people trust us. So I'd like to see that extended to our friends in Iraq.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone. And now we have a break upstairs for half an hour. And please make sure you come back for the next panel at 14:45. Thank you.